What was about to be uncovered in a forgotten attic in coastal Maine would rewrite everything historians thought they knew about World War II's missing treasures. The salty air of Camden Harbor carried memories of generations who had built there. Lives along Maine's rugged coastline. Waves crashed against the rocky shore with the same rhythm they had maintained for centuries, a constant backdrop to the small fishing community of just over 3,000 residents, where change came slowly, if at all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Captain Marcus Sullivan had never expected to return here, or anywhere stateside for that matter. At 34, he was a career Marine with 3 combat tours behind him, 2 in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq. The scars on his left shoulder and the occasional limp when the weather turned cold were physical reminders of choices that had defined his adult life. The psychological wounds ran deeper, hidden beneath the disciplined exterior that 15 years of military service had perfected. The letter arrived while he was stationed at Camp Lejeune, preparing a new platoon of Marines for deployment. "Your grandfather, Henry Sullivan, passed away last month," the attorney's formal correspondence stated. "As his only surviving relative, you have inherited the Sullivan family home and its surrounding property in Camden, Maine." Marcus had stared at the letter for a full 5 minutes, reading and rereading the words as if they might change or disappear. He had only met his grandfather 3 times. Once when he was 9, during a strained family reunion that revealed more rifts than connections. Again at his father's funeral when he was 16, where the old man had stood silently at the graveside, saying little but observing everything with piercing blue eyes that seemed to carry judgment for the grandson who had already decided on a military career. The third and final time was just before Marcus shipped out for his first deployment, a brief, awkward visit where his grandfather had asked pointed questions about Marcus's unit and deployment location, then nodded grimly. When Marcus explained security protocols prevented detailed answers. Henry Sullivan had been a mystery wrapped in silence, a World War II veteran who had returned from Europe in 1945 and spoken little about his experiences. Family lore suggested he had served in intelligence operations, but Henry himself had never confirmed or denied anything about his military service. He had lived alone in the Sullivan family home for nearly 50 years after Marcus's grandmother died, maintaining the isolated property with meticulous care while apparently cultivating few relationships in the community. The inheritance seemed both a blessing and a burden. The Sullivan house came mortgage-free, a historic property dating back to the 1880s that had remained in the family for generations. But it also came with property taxes Marcus couldn't easily afford on a Marine captain's salary and the complicated prospect of managing a home from hundreds of miles away while still on active duty. Marcus had accumulated 20 days of leave that his commanding officer had been urging him to take. "You haven't been stateside for more than 2 weeks at a stretch in 3 years, Sullivan," Colonel Harris had pointed out when Marcus brought him the letter. "Take the leave, sort out your grandfather's estate, get your head straight before we ramp up training for the next deployment." The flight to Portland followed by the drive up the coast to Camden had given Marcus time to consider his options. He could sell the property, using the proceeds to establish the financial security that military service had never provided. He could rent it out, creating income while preserving his tenuous connection to a family history he barely understood. Or he could hold onto it as a retirement option, a place to eventually settle when his Marine Corps days ended, assuming he survived the next deployment. The Sullivan house appeared through the rental car's windshield as Marcus navigated the winding coastal road that led to the property. The 2-story colonial sat on a bluff overlooking the Atlantic, its weathered gray shingles and white trim speaking of New England practicality and resilience against coastal storms. A detached garage that had once been a carriage house stood to one side, while a stone path led from the main house to what appeared to be a small boathouse near the water's edge. Marcus parked in the circular gravel driveway, his military duffel bag containing the only possessions he had brought for the 2-week leave. The house key had been included with the attorney's letter, a heavy brass item that looked like it belonged to an earlier era. As he approached the front porch, Marcus noticed the careful maintenance that belied his grandfather's advanced age. The paint was fresh, the wooden steps solid, the garden surrounding the house neat and organized even in the early spring. Chill. The interior revealed a home that had changed little since Marcus's childhood visits. Heavy wooden furniture, built to withstand generations of use, occupied spaces arranged for practicality rather than fashion. The living room featured a stone fireplace with a mantel displaying a few black and white photographs, Henry in his World War II uniform standing beside men whose names Marcus had never learned. His grandmother as a young woman on what must have been their wedding day, Marcus's father as a child standing on the same porch Marcus had just entered. What struck Marcus most was the sense of order that permeated every room. His grandfather had maintained the house with military precision, books aligned perfectly on shelves, kitchenware organized by function and size, clothing in the master bedroom closet arranged by season and type. It was the home of someone who valued control and structure, who had applied the disciplines of military service to civilian life with unwavering consistency. The attorney had mentioned that his grandfather had left specific instructions about the property and its contents, details that would be covered in a meeting scheduled for the following day. For tonight, Marcus was left alone with the ghosts of a family history he had never fully understood and the persistent question of why. His grandfather, a man who had barely acknowledged him in life, had left him everything. Sleep came fitfully in his grandfather's bedroom, the unfamiliar mattress and the constant sound of waves against the shoreline, creating a restlessness that military service had trained Marcus to push through. He woke at 05:00 out of habit, automatically, performing the morning physical training routine that 15 years of service had ingrained in his body, regardless of location or circumstance. The kitchen revealed his grandfather's continuing attention to detail. Coffee, filters, and basic supplies were arranged as if in preparation for a visitor. Despite Henry Sullivan having passed away nearly 2 months earlier, Marcus brewed coffee using his grandfather's percolator, a device that seemed from another era, but produced a beverage strong enough to satisfy military standards. Daylight revealed the property's true extent, nearly 3 acres stretching from the coastal road to the rocky shoreline, including mature pine trees that partially screened the house from neighboring properties. Marcus walked the boundaries, noting the stone walls that marked property lines established generations before, the well-maintained paths that led to different areas, and the boathouse that contained a restored wooden sailboat apparently maintained in perfect condition despite what must have been years since its last use. The attorney's office in downtown Camden occupied the second floor of a historic building that had housed the same law firm for over a century. James Harrington, whose family had apparently provided legal services to the Sullivans for generations, was a man in his 60s with the calm demeanor of someone accustomed to navigating complex family matters with professional discretion. "Captain Sullivan, your grandfather spoke of you often," Harrington said as they settled into his office, a space lined with law books and filing cabinets that suggested continuity and stability. "That's surprising," Marcus replied, unable to keep the skepticism from his voice. "We weren't close." "Henry was a private man," Harrington acknowledged, "but he followed your military career with considerable interest. He kept a file of news articles about your unit's deployments, your promotion to captain, even that medal citation from your second tour in Afghanistan." The information caught Marcus off guard. His grandfather had never acknowledged awareness of his military accomplishments, never sent so much as a congratulatory note when Marcus received his commission or returned from deployments. He was proud of you, Harrington continued, though I suspect he found it difficult to express that directly. Henry's generation, particularly men who served in his capacity during the war, often developed habits of emotional distance that remained with them throughout their lives. His capacity during the war? Marcus asked, sensing an opening to understand the mystery that had surrounded his grandfather's service. Henry was selective about what he shared, even with me, Harrington replied carefully. But the terms of his will and the instructions he left for you suggest that he wanted certain information to be passed to you specifically, perhaps because of your own military background. The attorney removed a sealed envelope from a folder bearing Henry Sullivan's name. Your grandfather left instructions that this was to be given to you privately, with the suggestion that you review its contents before we discuss the broader aspects of your inheritance. Marcus accepted the envelope, noting his name written in his grandfather's precise handwriting. The paper was heavy, expensive stock that seemed characteristic of the old man's attention to detail, even in small matters. I'll give you some privacy, Harrington said, rising from his desk. Take whatever time you need. There's no rush on these matters. Alone in the attorney's office, Marcus broke the seal on the envelope and removed several pages of handwritten text. His grandfather's writing was methodical, each letter formed with the precision that Marcus recognized from the few birthday cards he had received as a child. Marcus, the letter began without preamble. If you're reading this, I've finally run out of time to resolve matters that have remained unfinished for over 70 years. The house and property are yours without condition. Sell them, keep them, it's entirely your decision. But before you make any determinations about the property or its contents, you need to examine the materials stored in the attic space above. The east bedroom. Access is through a panel in the ceiling of the hallway closet. You'll need the key enclosed with this letter. What you'll find there represents the true reason I've left everything to you rather than donating the property to the Historical Society as I once planned. Your military background gives you the perspective to understand the significance of these materials and the judgment to determine their proper disposition. I've never been good at expressing sentiment, of failing your grandmother frequently, noted during our 43 years together. But I want you to know that I've followed your service career with pride, recognizing in your choices the same sense of duty that guided my own. We are more alike than you might realize, though I suspect that's not entirely a compliment from your perspective. The materials in the attic have been preserved for specific reasons that will become clear once you've reviewed them. Mr. Harrington has additional instructions to share regarding certain contacts who should be notified depending on your decisions. About these materials, choose carefully, but choose soon. Some matters have remained unresolved for too long already. The letter was signed simply Henry Sullivan, with no grandfatherly closing or additional personal message. Enclosed with the letter was a small brass key unlike any Marcus had seen in the house during his initial exploration. When Harrington returned to the office, Marcus had composed himself enough to ask practical questions about the property, taxes, and immediate responsibilities. The attorney provided organized documentation about the house's maintenance requirements, utility accounts, and property boundaries, all meticulously arranged in folders that reflected Henry Sullivan's systematic approach to even routine matters. Your grandfather was quite specific about one matter, Harrington said as their meeting concluded. He believed you would find materials in the house that might have historical significance. Should that occur, he asked that you contact this individual before making any decisions about those materials. The attorney handed Marcus a business card for Dr. Eleanor Blackwood, Department of History, Boston University. A handwritten note on the back in his grandfather's writing simply stated, "She understands the context and implications. Trust her judgment." Marcus returned to the Sullivan house with more questions than answers. the key from his grandfather's letter heavy in his pocket. The afternoon sun illuminated the property differently, highlighting the eastern portion of the house where his grandfather had directed him to examine the attic space. The hallway closet was organized with the same military precision that characterized the rest of the house: winter coats on one side, rain gear on the other, boots and shoes aligned perfectly on the floor. The ceiling panel was barely visible, designed to blend with the surrounding structure, but Marcus located it easily enough with his grandfather's directions. The small brass key fit a lock recessed into the panel. When turned, it released a mechanism that allowed the panel to swing downward, revealing a retractable ladder that descended with surprising smoothness for a system that must have been installed decades earlier. As with everything else in Henry Sullivan's domain, the attic access had been maintained with meticulous care. Marcus climbed the ladder into darkness, finding a light switch at the top that illuminated a space unlike anything he had expected. Rather than the cluttered storage area common to most homes, Henry Sullivan's attic was organized like a military archive. Metal shelving units contained labeled document boxes. A large table occupied the center of the space, its surface clear except for a leather portfolio positioned precisely in the middle. Map cases stood against one wall, while what appeared to be photographic equipment and development supplies occupied another area. The attic had been converted into a working space, ventilated and insulated, with the kind of organization system that Marcus recognized from military intelligence facilities. Whatever his grandfather had been preserving here, he had approached the task with professional thoroughness and security consciousness. The leather portfolio on the table contained a typed note on top: "Start here, Marcus. The chronology matters." Beneath it was a document folder labeled Operation Eagle's Nest, 1945, containing what appeared to be military orders, hand-drawn maps, and photographs that had yellowed with age. As Marcus began examining the contents, he realized he was looking at documentation of a classified World War II operation that had never appeared in any official history he had studied during his military education. The orders, bearing security classifications that would have been among the highest. In 1945, detailed a mission involving recovery of Nazi assets in the final days of the European campaign. His grandfather's name appeared on the personnel roster as Lieutenant Henry Sullivan, listed under a unit designation Marcus didn't recognize, but which appeared to be a specialized intelligence section, attached directly to General Eisenhower's headquarters. The mission parameters described a time-sensitive operation to secure assets of strategic and intelligence value from a location in the Bavarian Alps before advancing Soviet forces could reach the area. Photographs showed a younger version of his grandfather standing with several other men in military uniforms without insignia, examining what appeared to be documents and maps spread across a field table. Other images documented mountainous terrain, what seemed to be a concealed entrance to an underground facility, and crates being loaded onto military trucks. Most significantly, the file contained inventory documents listing items recovered during the operation, Nazi Party gold reserves, art and cultural artifacts stolen from across occupied Europe, and most intriguingly, a series of documents described only as intelligence materials of highest strategic value. Marcus lost track of time as he methodically reviewed the materials, his military training enabling him to recognize the significance of what his grandfather had preserved. This wasn't just historical documentation, it was evidence of a classified operation that had apparently recovered enormous material assets that had never been acknowledged in official accounts of World War II asset recovery efforts. As darkness fell outside, Marcus discovered a journal in his grandfather's handwriting, dated 1945-1946, detailing the aftermath of the operation and decisions made by senior Allied commanders about the disposition of the recovered assets. Journal documented disagreements among American, British, and French officials about how to handle the Nazi gold reserves in particular, with some arguing for complete disclosure and others advocating for creating strategic reserve funds that would never appear in official accounts. Most disturbing were his grandfather's detailed notes about specific senior officers who had diverted portions of the recovered gold, creating hidden caches that would remain untouched until post-war reconstruction needs had passed. The journal included coordinates, security protocols, and authentication procedures that would allow recovery of these assets that, according to his grandfather's calculations, would be worth over $150 million in contemporary valuation. The final entry, dated December 1946 before the journal continued decades later, contained his grandfather's moral wrestling with his own complicity. I followed orders and maintained secrecy as required by my oath and position, but I preserved documentation against the day when accountability might be possible. The assets hidden at the Alpine location were never intended for personal enrichment, but as strategic reserves. However, those who diverted portions for private use after the fact committed crimes against both their oaths and the nations they claimed to serve. I've maintained silence for what I believed were legitimate security reasons, but as the decades pass, I increasingly question whether national security was truly served or merely invoked to protect individual reputations and fortunes. The journal entries resumed in 1973, documenting his grandfather's careful research tracking the officers involved in the diversion of assets. Many had risen to senior positions in government, business, and NATO command structures. Henry Sullivan had methodically gathered evidence connecting these individuals to unexplained wealth, political influence, and decision-making authority that seemed linked to their shared secrets from 1945. As Marcus continued, reading through decades of his grandfather's investigation, a picture emerged of a man who had spent his post-war life conducting a one-person counterintelligence operation, gathering evidence while maintaining the cover of a quiet veteran living an unremarkable life in coastal Maine. The most recent journal entries, dated just months before Henry Sullivan's death, indicated that he had finally located the primary Alpine cache, untouched since 1945, containing both Nazi gold and intelligence documents that would reveal the full extent of post-war asset diversions by Allied officials. "I'm too old to finish this," his grandfather had written in his final entry. "My contacts in Europe confirm the site remains undisturbed but accessible with the proper authentication. Marcus has the background and judgment to determine whether justice after 70 years still matters more than the stability that might be disrupted by these revelations. The decision is his now." Marcus sat back, overwhelmed by the implications. His grandfather had left him far more than a house and property. He had entrusted him with evidence of what might be one of the largest undisclosed asset diversions in military history, along with the means to locate gold and documents that could rewrite historical understanding of post-war financial structures. More personally, he had discovered a grandfather entirely different from the silent, distant figure of his childhood memories. Henry Sullivan had been conducting a lifelong mission driven by principles of accountability and justice, preserving evidence while waiting for the right moment and the right person to determine its final disposition. The business card for Dr. Eleanor Blackwood suddenly made sense in this context. His grandfather had identified an academic historian who could help evaluate the historical significance of his documentation and potentially assist in bringing the information to light in a responsible manner. As Marcus carefully returned the materials to their organized locations, he realized that his 2 weeks of leave would be entirely inadequate for the task his grandfather had placed before him. This was not simply an estate to be settled, but a mission to be evaluated, planned, and potentially executed. A mission with historical, financial, and security implications that extended far beyond the peaceful coastal property where his grandfather had maintained his patient vigilance for over 7 decades. The weight of the decision pressed on Marcus as he descended from the attic, securing the access panel with the brass key that now represented far more than simple physical security. By morning, he would need to determine his first steps: whether to contact Dr. Blackwood, whether to report his discovery through military channels, or whether to continue his grandfather's patient, waiting game until he could fully evaluate all dimensions of what he had discovered. The Sullivan house seemed different now, transformed from a simple inheritance into the operational base for a mission that had remained active since 1945. As Marcus moved through rooms that had been maintained with such care for decades, he understood for the first time that his grandfather's precision and order had not been merely the habits of a disciplined military man, but the tradecraft of someone preserving critical evidence while hiding in plain sight. Tomorrow would bring decisions that would determine whether his grandfather's lifelong mission would finally reach completion or whether the secrets preserved in the attic would remain hidden for another generation. The Nazi gold and the documentation of who had diverted it had remained concealed for over 70 years. The question now was whether justice delayed for so long could still be meaningful, and whether Marcus Sullivan, Marine captain and unexpected, heir to a classified legacy, was prepared to accept the mission his grandfather had silently prepared him for throughout his life. Dawn broke over Camden Harbor, painting the Atlantic with shades of gold and amber that seemed to mock the secrets Marcus had discovered in his grandfather's attic. He'd slept little, his mind racing with the implications of what Henry Sullivan had preserved for over 7 decades, documentation of Nazi gold worth $150 million in today's value. Hidden in an alpine location that remained undisturbed since 1945, Marcus stood on the bluff behind the Sullivan house, watching fishing boats head out for their morning catch, their captains unaware that the quiet veteran who had lived in the colonial home for decades had been silently tracking one of World War II's greatest untold mysteries. The contradiction between the peaceful coastal scene and the explosive historical revelations in the attic created a dissonance that Marine Corps' training hadn't prepared him for. His morning coffee cooled beside him as he weighed his options. Military discipline suggested reporting his discovery through official channels, a decision that would likely result in immediate classification and the disappearance of his grandfather's meticulously preserved evidence into government archives. But Henry Sullivan had deliberately kept these materials outside official channels for decades, choosing instead to document, wait, and ultimately pass the evidence to Marcus rather than government authorities. The business card for Dr. Eleanor Blackwood felt heavy in Marcus's pocket. His grandfather's instruction to contact her before making any decisions suggested she possessed context or expertise that would inform whatever course of action he chose. A historian's perspective might help him understand the full implications of exposing a 70-year-old military secret that implicated Allied officers in the diversion of Nazi assets. The decision crystallized with military clarity. Before taking any irreversible steps, he needed more information about Dr. Blackwood, about the historical context of the operation, and about the potential consequences of exposing what his grandfather had documented. Intelligence gathering before action, a fundamental military principle that would serve him now as it had in combat operations. Marcus returned to the house, the decision bringing the temporary relief of having a clear next objective. He retrieved his laptop from his duffel bag and connected to the surprisingly robust internet service his grandfather had maintained. A search for Dr. Eleanor Blackwood revealed a distinguished academic career, professor of European history, specializing in World War II intelligence operations, author of 3 books on classified Allied activities, and recipient of academic honors for archival research that had revealed previously unknown aspects of military operations in the European theater. More intriguingly, her university biography mentioned that she had served as a historical consultant to declassification reviews for the Department of Defense and National Archives, suggesting she straddled the worlds of academic history and government security protocols. Her most recent publication, Shadows of Victory, Classified Asset Recovery Operations 1944 to 1946, addressed exactly the historical period and activities documented in his grandfather's attic. Marcus found her university contact information and composed a carefully worded email that revealed nothing specific but requested an urgent meeting regarding historical documentation preserved by Henry Sullivan that may relate to your research on classified asset recovery operations. He included his military rank and background, sensing that Dr. Blackwood would recognize the significance of a Marine captain reaching out about classified historical materials. While waiting for a response, Marcus returned to the attic to continue reviewing his grandfather's documentation. The morning light illuminated details he had missed in the previous evening's exploration, photographs that documented not just the operation itself, but surveillance images of the Allied officers his grandfather had tracked in subsequent decades. Henry Sullivan had conducted counterintelligence operations worthy of a specialized intelligence unit, maintaining surveillance on former colleagues who had risen to positions of significant power and influence. One filing cabinet contained newspaper clippings, financial records, and property documentation tracing unexplained wealth acquisitions by several officers from the original operation. His grandfather had meticulously documented how these individuals had acquired properties, established businesses, and wielded political influence that their military salaries and legitimate post-war opportunities couldn't explain. Most disturbing was evidence suggesting that some of these individuals had used their positions within NATO, the State Department, and military leadership to influence operational decisions that protected their secrets and, in some cases, eliminated potential witnesses to their activities. His grandfather had traced suspicious deaths, unexplained disappearances, and abrupt career terminations that formed a pattern of protective actions around the core group who knew about the diverted Nazi gold. Marcus's laptop chimed with an email notification. Dr. Blackwood had responded with surprising urgency. Captain Sullivan, I've been expecting contact from Henry's heir for some time. Your grandfather and I corresponded for nearly 15 years regarding his historical research. I can be in Camden tomorrow morning if that suits your timeline. This matter requires in-person discussion rather than electronic communication. Please confirm if 10 a.m. at the Sullivan property would be convenient. I'll arrive alone and with the discretion Henry always valued. Eleanor Blackwood. The rapid response and familiarity with his grandfather's situation suggested a relationship far deeper than casual academic consultation. Dr. Blackwood not only knew about Henry Sullivan's historical research, but had apparently been actively involved in evaluating or supporting his grandfather's documentation efforts for years. Marcus confirmed the meeting time, then returned to the methodical exploration of his grandfather's archive. In a locked drawer, opened by another key from his grandfather's key ring, he discovered documentation that extended beyond the financial aspects of the operation. Intelligence reports, some bearing classification levels that would still be considered highly restricted today, detailed Nazi scientific research recovered during the operation, research that had apparently been divided among Allied powers without full disclosure to oversight authorities. His grandfather had documented how certain scientific advances in the post-war period had their origins in this undisclosed Nazi research, developments in aerospace, materials science, and communications technology that had provided competitive advantages to specific Western corporations with ties to the officers involved in the original operation. The ethical compromises extended beyond financial self-enrichment to the exploitation of research conducted under unconscionable conditions by Nazi scientists. By evening, Marcus had developed a more complete understanding of what his grandfather had preserved, not merely evidence of financial misconduct by Allied officers, but documentation of a systemic pattern of moral compromises, exploitation of Nazi scientific atrocities, and ongoing influence operations that had shaped aspects of post-war geopolitics in ways that served private interests rather than transparent democratic processes. The scope of the revelation extended far beyond the $150 million in gold. It potentially rewrote understanding of how certain power structures in Western democracies had been influenced by compromised individuals with access to diverted Nazi assets and research. His grandfather had assembled evidence that challenged fundamental narratives about post-war reconstruction, scientific advancement, and democratic oversight of military operations. As darkness fell over Camden Harbor, Marcus secured the attic and prepared the house for Dr. Blackwood's visit. Whatever perspective she might offer, he now understood why his grandfather had preserved this evidence for decades while waiting for the right moment and the right person to determine its final disposition. The implications extended beyond historical curiosity to questions of justice, accountability, and the integrity of democratic institutions that had been compromised at their formation by secret diversions of Nazi assets. Sleep came more easily. That night, the temporary relief of having taken concrete action, allowing his military-trained mind to capture necessary rest before the next operational phase. Tomorrow would bring new information, expert consultation, and the beginning of decisions that would determine whether his grandfather's lifetime mission would finally achieve its objective. Dr. Eleanor Blackwood arrived precisely at 10 a.m., parking a modest sedan behind Marcus's rental car in the circular driveway. She emerged with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to navigating sensitive situations, carrying a leather briefcase that suggested she had come prepared with her own documentation. In her early 60s with silver-streaked dark hair and the intense focus that characterized serious academic researchers, she approached the house with the familiarity of someone who had visited before. "Captain Sullivan," she said, extending her hand with a firm grip that matched her direct gaze. "Thank you for continuing your grandfather's discretion in this matter." "Dr. Blackwood," Marcus replied, recognizing in her demeanor something that reminded him of intelligence officers he had encountered during his deployments. "I'm still processing the scope of what my grandfather preserved." "Henry was extraordinarily thorough," she said as he led her into the house. It was his defining characteristic, both professionally and personally. The casual reference to his grandfather's professional attributes confirmed Marcus's growing suspicion that Dr. Blackwood knew far more about Henry Sullivan than her academic credentials might suggest. "You knew him well," Marcus observed as they settled in the living room, deliberately choosing a statement rather than a question to see what information she might volunteer. "I knew him first through his documentation," she replied carefully. "Academic research led me to evidence of Operation Eagle's Nest that didn't align with official records. When I published preliminary findings in 2005, Henry reached out to me privately. Our collaboration evolved from there." "Collaboration suggests he shared his documentation with you," Marcus said, testing boundaries before revealing what he had discovered. Dr. Blackwood smiled slightly, acknowledging the careful interrogation. "Henry shared selected materials that helped authenticate my research without compromising his broader documentation. He was cautious about electronic communication and digital records, a security consciousness that served his mission well." "His mission," Marcus repeated, the phrasing confirming that Dr. Blackwood understood his grandfather had been engaged in something far more purposeful than casual historical research. Henry viewed himself as the custodian of truth that powerful interests had conspired to conceal, she said, opening her briefcase and removing a folder. He believed accountability mattered, even after decades, but he also recognized that exposing these truths carried significant risks to institutional stability and public trust. It was a moral complexity he struggled with throughout his life. "He's left that struggle to me," Marcus said, revealing his discovery of the attic archive. along with evidence that appears to document one of the largest undisclosed diversions of assets in military history. Dr. Blackwood nodded, unsurprised. The Nazi gold is actually the least historically significant aspect of what Henry documented, though it tends to capture immediate attention. The more consequential evidence concerns how diverted assets and scientific research shaped post-war power structures and technological developments, influences that continue to the present day. She opened her folder, revealing photographs and documents that complemented what Marcus had discovered in the attic. I've spent 15 years verifying aspects of Henry's documentation through independent, archival research across European and American repositories. The evidence is substantive, disturbing, and historically transformative. Why didn't he take this public while he was alive? Marcus asked, the question that had troubled him since discovering the extent of his grandfather's documentation. Henry was weighing competing moral imperatives, Dr. Blackwood explained. Justice and accountability on one side, potential institutional damage on the other. The individuals directly involved in the asset diversion have mostly died, but the institutions and power structures they created remain influential. Exposing the foundations of those structures carries consequences beyond simple historical correction. He mentioned justice after 70 years in his final journal entry, Marcus said, questioning whether it still matters more than stability. That was our final conversation, Dr. Blackwood acknowledged. 3 weeks before his death, Henry called me to discuss whether the time had finally arrived for full disclosure. He believed you were the appropriate person to make that determination, given your military background and what he called your clear moral compass. The characterization surprised Marcus, given how little direct interaction he had with his grandfather. He barely knew me. He knew you better than you realize, Dr. Blackwood replied. Henry maintained awareness of your career through channels you wouldn't have detected. Your combat decisions, your leadership approach, even your handling of that difficult situation with civilian casualties in your second deployment. He assessed all of it in determining whether you were the right custodian for his life's work. The revelation that his grandfather had been essentially running counterintelligence operations against his own grandson was both disturbing and strangely moving, evidence of how seriously Henry Sullivan had taken the responsibility of preserving and potentially exposing his documentation. What channels could a retired veteran in Maine possibly have to access information about classified operations in Afghanistan? Marcus asked, professional security concerns momentarily overriding personal reactions. Dr. Blackwood's expression suggested she had anticipated the question. Your grandfather maintained connections with former colleagues who advanced to senior positions in military intelligence and special operations communities. His own background provided access that his quiet retirement in Camden deliberately obscured. What exactly was his background? Marcus asked, realizing how little he actually knew about Henry Sullivan's military service. Officially, he served in Army intelligence, attached to SHA-E's Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. Dr. Blackwood explained. In reality, he was part of a specialized unit that operated under direct authority from Allied command with minimal oversight or documentation. Their activities included asset recovery, intelligence acquisition, and what would now be called counterintelligence operations against both Axis forces and potential security risks within Allied structures. He was OSS? Marcus asked, referring to the Office of Strategic Services, World War II predecessor to the CIA. Adjacent to but distinct from OSS, she clarified. His unit operated with authorities that sometimes exceeded even those granted to OSS, particularly in the final months of the European campaign, when asset recovery became a priority for multiple competing interests within the Allied command structure. The historian removed another document from her briefcase, a declassified but heavily redacted personnel record that contained his grandfather's name and a unit designation that had been obscured in official records. This is the only official acknowledgement of the unit's existence that has ever been declassified, she explained. I obtained it through 3 years of Freedom of Information requests and appeals. The level of persistent classification after 75 years indicates the sensitivity that still surrounds their operations. Marcus processed this information, connecting it with the documentation he had reviewed in the attic. And the gold, the location in the Alps? Henry confirmed its existence and general location to me, but never shared the specific coordinates or authentication protocols, Dr. Blackwood said. He believed that information should remain compartmentalized until a final decision was made about disclosure and recovery. He left that information in his documentation, Marcus confirmed, along with what appears to be complete authentication procedures that would still be valid. Dr. Blackwood leaned forward slightly, her professional demeanor intensifying. That makes your position significantly more complex, Captain Sullivan. Possession of those specifics creates both opportunity and considerable risk. From whom? Marcus asked, his military assessment of the situation immediately focusing on potential threat vectors. Several categories of interested parties, she replied with academic precision. First, descendants of the original officers involved in the diversion, some of whom inherited both wealth and political connections without necessarily knowing their origins. Second, government agencies that would prefer this history remain classified to avoid institutional embarrassment and liability. Third, private entities that have benefited from scientific advances with origins in the undisclosed Nazi research. You're suggesting active opposition rather than simply historical resistance, Marcus observed. Henry's research documented several instances where individuals who discovered partial evidence of the operation experienced professional destruction, unexplained accidents, or outright disappearance, Dr. Blackwood confirmed. The pattern became less violent but more sophisticated in recent decades: character assassination, professional discrediting, and strategic isolation rather than physical elimination. The assessment aligned with Marcus's own evaluation of his grandfather's surveillance documentation. The threats were real, sophisticated, and potentially lethal, operational security concerns that his military background had prepared him to evaluate. What's your recommendation? He asked, recognizing in Dr. Blackwood an ally with valuable perspective on both historical significance and security implications. A phased approach, she replied without hesitation. First, secure redundant documentation in multiple protected locations, digital and physical copies, with distribution that would make complete suppression impossible. Second, preliminary contact with specific journalists and academic researchers who have demonstrated both integrity and security consciousness in handling sensitive historical materials. Third, preparation of a comprehensive publication strategy that would release the documentation in a manner that maximizes accountability while minimizing institutional damage. The plan reflected both academic thoroughness and practical security awareness, qualities that explained why his grandfather had trusted Dr. Blackwood with partial knowledge of his documentation. And the gold itself? Marcus asked. That presents the most complex ethical questions, she acknowledged. Recovery would provide irrefutable physical evidence supporting the documentation, but it also creates significant legal and procedural complications. Various nations, institutions, and individuals could assert legitimate or strategic claims to those assets. The complexity of the situation was becoming clearer to Marcus. This wasn't simply a matter of exposing historical truth, but navigating competing legitimate interests, security concerns, and ethical considerations that extended well beyond the initial question of disclosure. My grandfather spent his entire adult life preserving this evidence, Marcus said after a thoughtful pause. He clearly believed it mattered, yet he never took the final step of disclosure during his lifetime. Henry was waiting for the right conditions, Dr. Blackwood explained. He believed premature disclosure would result in successful suppression, while disclosure without proper preparation would cause institutional damage that might outweigh the justice achieved. His patience wasn't indecision, it was strategic calculation. The characterization aligned with the methodical, security-conscious approach evident in his grandfather's documentation. Henry Sullivan had been playing a very long game gathering evidence, tracking individuals, and preparing for an eventual disclosure that would be impossible to dismiss or suppress. "I need time to review everything thoroughly before making decisions," Marcus said, his military training asserting the principle of complete intelligence assessment before action. "That's prudent," Dr. Blackwood agreed. "But I should warn you that your timeline may not be entirely under your control. Henry's death, the transfer of property, and your arrival in Camden may have triggered attention from individuals who monitor such matters out of ongoing concern about potential disclosure. You're suggesting we may be under surveillance already," Marcus observed, his combat-honed situational awareness immediately elevating. "It would be consistent with patterns Henry documented in similar situations," she confirmed. His own counter-surveillance measures were quite sophisticated for a supposedly retired veteran in a coastal town, but he was concerned that his death might create a vulnerability period during property transfer. The security implications shifted Marcus's thinking from historical evaluation to more immediate operational considerations. If his grandfather's documentation was as significant as it appeared, and if interests opposed to its disclosure were as determined as the evidence suggested, then his 2 weeks of leave had just transformed into something closer to a deployment in contested territory. "I need to establish basic security protocols immediately," he said, military training providing clear priorities in the face of potential threats. "Henry maintained certain measures you should be aware of," Dr. Blackwood replied, removing a final document from her briefcase. "This details the security systems, observation points, and evacuation procedures he established over the years. Some are quite ingenious for their simplicity and effectiveness." The document revealed yet another dimension of his grandfather's methodical preparation: physical security measures disguised as ordinary features of the coastal property, observation systems that provided early warning of approach from any direction, and multiple evacuation options that included the boathouse Marcus had observed during his initial exploration. "He lived in a constant state of readiness," Marcus observed, a new understanding of his grandfather's isolated lifestyle emerging from the security documentation. Henry understood that preservation of truth sometimes requires physical security as well as documentation integrity, Dr. Blackwood said. He established measures that would appear to casual observation as the normal precautions of an elderly veteran living alone on valuable coastal property. As their meeting continued through the morning, Marcus gained a more complete understanding of both his grandfather's mission and the complex ethical and security considerations that now fell to him as the inheritor of Henry Sullivan's life work. Dr. Blackwood provided historical context, verification of key aspects of the documentation, and practical guidance about secure communication methods that would support whatever disclosure approach he ultimately chose. By early afternoon, they had established a working framework for immediate next steps: comprehensive review of the documentation, establishment of secure redundant storage for critical evidence, and preliminary assessment of potential disclosure. Pathways that would maximize historical accountability while managing security risks. "I'll be returning to Boston this evening," Dr. Blackwood said as their meeting concluded, "but I can make myself available as needed for consultation and support." Henry trusted you with this responsibility for reasons that became clearer to me during our conversation today. Your military experience provides not just security awareness but ethical framework for evaluating competing legitimate interests. As Marcus walked her to her car, the coastal breeze carrying the scent of pine and salt water, he felt the weight of inheritance that extended far beyond the physical property. His grandfather had entrusted him with evidence that could reshape historical understanding, provide accountability for long-concealed misconduct, and potentially expose continuing influence operations that affected contemporary political and economic structures. "Dr. Blackwood," he said as she prepared to depart, "did my grandfather ever express regret about his own role in the original operation? About following orders that included concealing these diversions?" She paused, considering the question with academic care. Henry struggled with that moral complexity throughout his life. He believed his initial compliance was justified by legitimate security concerns in the immediate post-war environment. His subsequent documentation efforts represented atonement for that compliance, preserving truth while waiting for the right moment to ensure its disclosure would serve justice, rather than merely creating chaos. The answer provided insight into the moral journey that had defined Henry Sullivan's quiet, isolated life in Camden. Initial compliance followed by lifelong dedication to eventual accountability. Patient documentation coupled with strategic, waiting for conditions that would make truth both undeniable and consequential. As Dr. Blackwood's car disappeared down the coastal road, Marcus turned back toward the Sullivan house with new perspective on both the property and his own unexpected mission. What had begun as a simple inheritance had evolved into something far more significant: custodianship of historical truth that powerful interests had conspired to conceal for over 70 years, and responsibility for determining how and when that truth should finally emerge from the shadows of classified history. The Nazi gold hidden in its Alpine cache represented physical evidence that would make the documentation undeniable, but the greater value lay in the historical accountability it would enable, recognition of how diverted assets and exploited. Research had shaped post-war power structures in ways that continued to influence contemporary institutions and decisions. Marine Captain Marcus Sullivan, who had expected a brief leave to settle his grandfather's estate, now found himself deployed to a different kind of battlefield, one where the weapons were documented truth, the territory was historical understanding, and the objective was accountability that had been strategically delayed but never abandoned by a patient, methodical veteran who had spent decades preparing for this moment. The mission parameters were becoming clearer, though the specific operational plan remained to be determined. Marcus climbed the stairs to the attic where his grandfather's documentation awaited further review, recognizing that he had inherited not just evidence but obligation, the final phase of a mission that Henry Sullivan had begun in the mountains of Bavaria in 1945 and pursued with quiet determination for over 70 years. The first sign of surveillance came at dusk, barely noticeable to anyone without combat zone experience. A sedan with darkened windows moved slowly past the Sullivan property, its pace too measured for a tourist admiring coastal homes, its windows too opaque for Maine's vehicle regulations. Marcus observed it from the eastern window of the living room, his posture casual but his attention laser-focused on details. Government plates partially obscured by mud, two occupants maintaining a disciplined forward gaze rather than the natural head movements of civilians. Dr. Blackwood's warning about monitoring had materialized within hours of her departure. Marcus continued his relaxed posture by the window while mentally shifting into operational security mode, accessing patterns of threat assessment that 3 combat deployments had burned into his neural pathways. The vehicle's controlled movement suggested professional observation rather than immediate intervention, intelligence gathering preceding potential action. Using his grandfather's security documentation as guidance, Marcus initiated casual countermeasures that would appear natural to observers while providing tactical advantages. He moved through the house, turning on lights and patterns that suggested normal evening activities, while systematically activating the surprisingly sophisticated observation systems Henry Sullivan had integrated into the property structure. A modified thermostat in the kitchen accessed a series of cameras disguised as ordinary fixtures on the property's perimeter. A bookshelf in the study concealed monitoring equipment that could detect electronic surveillance attempts. Most impressively, the boathouse contained communications equipment that operated on frequencies unlikely to be monitored by conventional surveillance. "Well played, grandfather," Marcus murmured as he discovered each element of Henry Sullivan's security infrastructure. The systems reflected professional intelligence tradecraft, updated over decades, simple, redundant, and disguised within ordinary objects that would survive casual inspection. By midnight, Marcus had established a complete situational assessment. 3 separate vehicles had conducted surveillance rotations, suggesting a professional team of at least 6 personnel. Electronic scanning had detected 2 attempted wireless intrusions on his laptop security, unsuccessful thanks to his military-grade protections, but indicative of technical capabilities beyond ordinary law enforcement. Most significantly, property records for the Sullivan house had been accessed through the county database less than an hour after Dr. Blackwood's departure, indicating active interest in establishing legal parameters for potential intervention. Marcus recognized the pattern from intelligence briefings on domestic surveillance operations, information gathering preceding legal justification for more direct action. The immediate security situation clarified his next priorities. First, establish secure redundancy for his grandfather's documentation before any potential intervention could contain it. Second, implement a communication strategy that would trigger protective measures if he were subjected to detention or interrogation. Third, evaluate pathways for controlled disclosure that would maximize protection while ensuring the documentation couldn't be completely suppressed. Marcus moved quickly but methodically, his combat experience providing both urgency and discipline. Execution. Using equipment from his grandfather's archive, he created digital copies of the most critical documentation, encrypting them with military-grade protocols before transferring them to 3 separate storage devices. The original materials remained organized in the attic, but their contents now existed in multiple formats that could be distributed if necessary. Next, he drafted a secure communication to Dr. Blackwood, using encryption methods they had established during her visit. The message was simple but clear: observation confirmed. Proceeding with Phase 1 security protocols. If no contact within 72 hours, initiate contingency distribution. The communication established a deadman switch that would ensure the documentation reached multiple academic and journalistic recipients if Marcus were prevented from maintaining regular contact. By 0400, he had completed essential security measures and allowed himself 2 hours of tactical rest, the disciplined sleep pattern of a combat Marine who understood that physical preparedness required managed recovery periods. His grandfather's bedroom now represented both sanctuary and tactical position, offering privacy from external observation while providing clear sight lines to the property's main approach routes. Dawn brought new developments that confirmed the escalating interest in the Sullivan property. A Coast Guard vessel conducted an extended patrol unusually close to the shoreline, maintaining position with clear observation angles to the house and boathouse. Property tax assessors, or individuals presenting themselves as such, appeared at neighboring properties, creating pretexts for legal proximity while establishing observation points. Most telling was the sudden restoration of a telephone pole on the coastal road adjacent to the Sullivan property, infrastructure maintenance that had been notably absent during Henry Sullivan's lifetime despite multiple coastal storms that had affected other sections of the utility network. Marcus recognized these activities as classic preparation for potential containment operations, establishing legal presence, technical surveillance capabilities, and intervention options, while maintaining plausible civilian explanations for each element. The pattern suggested coordination between multiple agencies rather than a single organizational interest, exactly the kind of response his grandfather's documentation had predicted for discovery events. The escalating surveillance created urgency but also operational clarity. Whatever his grandfather's documentation contained clearly warranted significant resource allocation by entities with substantial authority. The rapid response to merely his presence and Dr. Blackwood's visit suggested sensitive triggers that Henry Sullivan had anticipated in his security planning. Marcus initiated the next phase of countermeasures, activation of his grandfather's contingency protocols for evidence preservation. In the boathouse, behind maintenance equipment that had remained untouched for years, he located a sealed container with international courier packaging, prepared with addresses for 3 separate law firms in different countries. Each package contained identical instructions for distribution of enclosed materials to specific academic institutions and media organizations in the event of specific triggering conditions. The materials themselves were not present. Henry Sullivan had separated distribution mechanisms from content as basic security practice, but the infrastructure for contingency disclosure had been meticulously prepared, requiring only the addition of the critical documentation Marcus had now secured in digital formats. As he completed preparation of the contingency packages, Marcus's military phone vibrated with a text message from his commanding officer. "Sullivan, check in ASAP. Situation developing regarding your leave status." The message confirmed his assessment of multi-agency coordination. His chain of command would only be involved if entities with significant authority had initiated official inquiries regarding his activities. The reference to leave status suggested the creation of administrative pretext for recall, a common approach when direct intervention might create unwanted attention. Marcus responded with appropriate military brevity. "Roger, all good in Maine. Family matters proceeding normally. We'll check in daily as required." The message established expected communication patterns while revealing nothing about his actual situation assessment or his grandfather's documentation. His grandfather's journal had described similar attention following periodic verification visits to the Alpine cache location, surveillance that increased when Henry Sullivan's European travel coincided with inquiries about specific aspects of post-war asset disposition. The pattern had repeated over decades, suggesting persistent monitoring by entities concerned about potential disclosure of Operation Eagle's Nest and its aftermath. What had changed was the comprehensive nature of Henry Sullivan's documentation, and the specific information about the Alpine location where Nazi gold and compromising intelligence materials remained hidden. His grandfather had conducted verification visits but had never attempted recovery, choosing instead to confirm the cache remained undisturbed while building his case through documentary evidence. As morning progressed, Marcus maintained normal activities visible from external observation points, property maintenance, inspection of the boathouse, routine movements that would appear consistent with a military officer on leave handling a family inheritance. Meanwhile, he continued methodical review of his grandfather's documentation, focusing now on materials that detailed the Alpine cache location and authentication protocols. The coordinates indicated a location in the Bavarian Alps near the Austrian border, in terrain that had seen minimal development since 1945 due to conservation regulations and challenging access conditions. His grandfather's notes included detailed topographical information, approach routes, and specific authentication markers that would identify the concealed entrance to the underground facility, where the Nazi gold and intelligence materials had been secured. Most critically, the documentation included authentication protocols that would still function, physical keys, recognition phrases, and mechanical access mechanisms that operated independently of electronic systems or databases that might have been updated or monitored in subsequent decades. Henry Sullivan had verified as recently as 3 years earlier that these access methods remained viable, though his age and declining health had prevented him from executing actual recovery. By midday, Marcus had completed comprehensive review of the documentation related to the Alpine cache and had reached Initial conclusions about his grandfather's ultimate objectives. Henry Sullivan had preserved evidence of the Nazi gold's location, not primarily for recovery of the financial assets, but as irrefutable physical proof of the larger pattern of post-war asset diversion and institutional compromise that his documentary evidence described. The gold itself, estimated at $150 million in contemporary valuation, was less significant than the intelligence materials secured alongside it, which documented specific officers' involvement in diverting Nazi assets, scientific research, and personnel into unofficial channels that served private interests rather than transparent Allied objectives. Recovery of these materials would provide physical evidence that couldn't be dismissed as forgery or misinterpretation, establishing the foundation for the historical accountability his grandfather had pursued for decades. As Marcus considered his next steps, a new vehicle appeared at the property entrance, an unmarked black SUV with government-issue tires and antenna configurations that suggested federal law enforcement rather than state or local authorities. Two men in suits emerged, their bearing and tactical awareness immediately identifiable to Marcus as federal agents with likely military or intelligence backgrounds. The moment of direct contact had arrived sooner than anticipated, accelerating decision timelines and narrowing tactical options. Marcus activated the final elements of his grandfather's security protocols, a triggered distribution system that would send notification and access codes for the secure documentation to Dr. Blackwood if he didn't cancel the automatic transmission within 12 hours. Then, rather than waiting for the agents to approach, Marcus stepped onto the front porch to meet them directly. Combat experience had taught him that seizing initiative often provided tactical advantages even in asymmetric confrontations. "Gentlemen," he called out with practiced casualness, "something I can help you with?" The agents exchanged brief glances that confirmed coordination before the taller of the two responded. "Captain Marcus Sullivan? I'm Special Agent Thomas Reeves with the FBI, and this is Special Agent James Harmon. We'd like to ask you some questions about your grandfather's property and certain materials that may be stored here." Marcus maintained a relaxed posture while noting details that his military training highlighted: the slight bulge of shoulder holsters under both men's jackets, the communication earpieces visible on close inspection, and the tactical positioning that provided each agent clear fields of fire while maintaining distance between them. "Happy to help if I can," Marcus replied, projecting cooperative openness while revealing nothing. "Though I'm still learning about my grandfather's property myself. Only been here a few days. May we come inside, Captain?" Agent Reeves asked, the phrasing a polite request that carried implicit authority. "Of course," Marcus agreed, recognizing that refusing entry would only accelerate more aggressive intervention options. "Though I'd appreciate seeing credentials first. Professional habit from deployment protocols." The agents produced FBI identification with practiced efficiency, the materials appearing authentic to Marcus's experienced assessment. He examined them carefully, noting names and badge numbers for potential verification, before leading the agents into the house with the relaxed confidence of someone with nothing to hide. "Your grandfather had quite a collection of historical materials," Agent Harmon observed as they entered the living room, his gaze sweeping the bookshelves with professional assessment rather than casual interest. "World War II veteran," Marcus replied with deliberate understatement. "Seemed to maintain an interest in military history throughout his life. Our understanding is that interest extended to classified operational documentation," Agent Reeves said, abandoning pretense with efficiency that suggested limited time parameters for their approach. Specifically, materials related to asset recovery operations in the European theater in 1945. The direct reference to classified operations confirmed what Marcus had already assessed. This wasn't routine inquiry, but targeted intervention, based on specific intelligence about his grandfather's documentation. The rapid escalation from surveillance to direct contact indicated high priority and significant authority behind the investigation. "I'm still cataloging my grandfather's collections," Marcus replied, maintaining plausible deniability without direct falsehood. "There's quite a lot of material. May I ask what specific documentation interests the FBI?" "Captain Sullivan," Agent Reeves said, his tone shifting to reflect awareness of speaking to a military officer with security clearance experience. "We're representing a multi-agency task force with authorization to secure classified materials related to Operation Eagle's Nest that may have been improperly retained by your grandfather." The explicit reference to the operation name eliminated any doubt about the specific focus of their intervention. Marcus maintained his composed demeanor, while rapidly evaluating options. Direct confrontation would accelerate escalation and potentially trigger containment protocols that could include property seizure and detention. Continued denial despite their specific knowledge would undermine credibility for potential negotiation. "I see," Marcus said, choosing his words with tactical precision. "And if such materials existed, what would be the objective of securing them at this point?" Historical operations from 1945 would seem to have limited current security implications. That determination would be made by appropriate classification authorities. Agent Harmon replied with the practiced language of security protocols. "Our role is simply to ensure that any classified materials are properly secured and returned to authorized repositories." The response was standard procedure, but revealed the limited operational parameters of the agents themselves. They were tasked with recovery rather than evaluation, suggesting they might not have complete knowledge of the documentation's specific contents or implications. "Of course," Marcus agreed, projecting reasonable cooperation. "I'd be happy to review my grandfather's collections with that in mind. My military background gives me some familiarity with classification protocols, though obviously the standards from 1945 differ from current practice. We have authorization to conduct a comprehensive search of the property," Agent Reeves said, producing a document that appeared to be a warrant. "But we'd prefer to proceed cooperatively given your military status and security clearance." Marcus reviewed the warrant, noting that it authorized search and seizure of classified materials related to military operations during and immediately following World War II, language broad enough to encompass his grandfather's entire documentation. Archive while specific enough to target the Operation Eagle's Nest materials. "I understand," Marcus said, continuing his cooperative approach while internally activating contingency planning. "Since we share the objective of proper handling of potentially sensitive historical materials, perhaps you could clarify the specific handling protocols you're authorized to implement. My concern would be preservation of historical context and integrity during any transfer process." The question was strategically designed to evaluate the agent's actual authorization parameters and to establish Marcus's position as a security-conscious military officer concerned with proper procedures, rather than obstruction. Agent Reeves exchanged another brief glance with his partner before responding. "We're authorized to secure any classified materials for transfer to a specialized assessment team that will determine appropriate disposition. Given the historical nature of these materials, proper archival handling has been authorized." The response confirmed Marcus's assessment. These agents were the initial recovery team, tasked with securing materials for subsequent evaluation by others with greater authority and likely more complete knowledge of the operation's implications. This created potential leverage for negotiated outcomes rather than simple confiscation. "That seems reasonable," Marcus agreed. "Though my grandfather appears to have been quite methodical about historical documentation, any removal of materials would be most effective if it maintained his organizational systems and contextual references. We have specialists available for proper handling," Agent Harmon assured him. Though his tone suggested limited patience for procedural discussions, that delayed their primary objective. Excellent, Marcus replied. Since we're approaching this professionally, I should mention that certain materials may have been prepared for academic research through appropriate declassification reviews. My grandfather corresponded with several historians about declassified aspects of his service. The reference to academic connections and declassification processes introduced complexity to what the agents had likely anticipated as a straightforward recovery operation. Marcus observed their reactions carefully, noting the subtle shift in Agent Reeves' posture that suggested recalibration of approach. Any decisions about declassification status would be made by the assessment team, Agent Reeves stated, though with slightly less certainty than his previous assertions. Of course, Marcus agreed. I'm simply providing context that might assist in appropriate handling. My grandfather was particularly careful about distinguishing between materials that had been properly declassified and those that retained classification restrictions. The tactical conversation continued as Marcus led the agents through the house, maintaining the appearance of cooperative professionalism, while systematically establishing parameters that would complicate immediate seizure of all documentation. By introducing considerations of declassification status, academic research connections, and proper archival handling, he created procedural friction that might provide time for his contingency measures to activate if necessary. As they approached the hallway leading to the attic access, Marcus made a calculated decision to shift from tactical delay to conditional cooperation. Gentlemen, to be completely transparent, my grandfather did maintain an organized archive of historical materials in the attic space. Some materials appear to relate to his military service, though I'm still evaluating their specific nature and status. The acknowledgement represented a tactical concession that prevented the agents from characterizing his behavior as obstruction while maintaining ambiguity about the specific contents and his knowledge of them. It also positioned him as a security-conscious military officer voluntarily cooperating with appropriate authorities, rather than a potential adversary requiring aggressive intervention. We appreciate your cooperation, Captain, Agent Reeves responded, his tone reflecting recalibration of their approach. Our objective is proper handling of potentially sensitive materials, not adversarial enforcement. We share that objective, Marcus assured him, leading them to the attic access. My military service has given me considerable respect for proper security protocols. I simply want to ensure my grandfather's historical documentation is handled with appropriate care for both security and historical integrity. As they climbed into the attic space where Henry Sullivan had preserved his meticulous documentation for decades, Marcus maintained his composed professionalism while mentally confirming that his contingency measures were in place. The digital copies were secured in locations the agents were unlikely to discover in initial search. The automated notification to Dr. Blackwood would trigger if he couldn't cancel it within the remaining hours. The distribution packages in the boathouse were prepared for activation if necessary. Whatever happened next, his grandfather's lifetime mission of documentation and eventual disclosure had been preserved through redundancy and contingency planning. The Nazi gold and compromising intelligence materials remained secure in their Alpine cache, their location and authentication protocols, now existing in multiple secure formats that would survive even complete confiscation of the original documentation. As Agent Reeves surveyed the meticulously organized archive, with visible surprise at its scope and professional organization, Marcus recognized that this initial intervention represented only the beginning of what would likely be a complex extended engagement with powerful interests determined to control information that had remained hidden for over 70 years. Your grandfather was extremely thorough, Agent Reeves observed, his tone reflecting reassessment of the situation's complexity. He believed in the importance of complete and accurate historical records, Marcus replied, the understatement carrying significance that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation in the Sullivan attic. The agents began systematic examination of the archive's organization, their approach suggesting professional respect for the methodical documentation, even as they pursued their recovery objectives. Whatever they had expected to find, Henry Sullivan's comprehensive, professionally organized archive clearly exceeded their anticipation in both scope and sophistication. Marcus observed their methodical process, maintaining his cooperative demeanor, while internally confirming that his grandfather's mission remained secure regardless of what physical materials might be removed from the attic. The truth Henry Sullivan had preserved for 70 years now existed in redundant forms that ensured it would finally reach appropriate disclosure channels, even if Marcus himself were removed from the process. The confrontation he had prepared for had evolved instead into a complex tactical engagement, where physical materials might be conceded while the essential mission remained protected. Through distributed contingency measures, his grandfather had anticipated this scenario in his security planning, creating layered defenses that protected the truth itself rather than merely its physical documentation. As the federal agents continued their examination of Henry Sullivan's lifetime of methodical documentation, Marcus felt an unexpected sense of connection to the grandfather he had barely known. They shared not just military service but a fundamental commitment to mission accomplishment through disciplined planning, contingency preparation, and strategic patience. The Nazi gold hidden in its Alpine cache would eventually serve its intended purpose, not as financial gain, but as irrefutable physical evidence supporting historical truth that powerful interests had conspired to conceal. Henry Sullivan's patient, methodical mission would reach completion, though perhaps through pathways he hadn't specifically anticipated when entrusting his documentation to the grandson whose character he had assessed from a distance. The spring sunlight filtering through the attic windows illuminated decades of disciplined documentation that would soon transition from private archive to historical revelation, a transition secured not through confrontation but through the same methodical preparation and strategic patience that had characterized Henry Sullivan's lifetime mission of preservation and eventual accountability. The federal intervention lasted 14 hours, extending into darkness as agents Reeves and Harmon were joined by a specialized team that arrived in unmarked vans with equipment for document handling and analysis. They worked with methodical precision, photographing and cataloging each element of Henry Sullivan's archive before carefully removing materials for transport to what they described as a secure assessment facility. Throughout the process, Marcus maintained his cooperative, professional demeanor while observing the team's priorities and procedures. Their focus centered primarily on documentation directly related to Operation Eagle's Nest, particularly materials detailing the Alpine cache location, authentication protocols, and evidence connecting specific Allied officers to asset diversion. They showed less interest in his grandfather's subsequent surveillance documentation, tracking those officers' post-war activities and influence operations. The selective approach to the archive suggested the team had specific knowledge about the operation and its aftermath. They weren't conducting a general seizure of classified materials but targeting documentation of particular activities and individuals. Their efficiency implied thorough briefing about what they expected to find, though their occasional expressions of surprise indicated Henry Sullivan's documentation exceeded even their specific expectations. By midnight, they had removed approximately 60% of the archive, focusing on original operational materials while leaving much of his grandfather's subsequent research and surveillance documentation. The leader of the specialized team, who identified herself only as Dr. Collins, provided Marcus with detailed inventory documentation and formal receipt for all materials removed from the property. "Captain Sullivan," she said as the team prepared to depart, "we appreciate your cooperation in this sensitive matter. These materials will undergo proper security review and historical assessment. I trust they'll be handled with appropriate respect for both security protocols and historical integrity, Marcus replied, maintaining his professional military bearing while conveying the expectation of proper handling. Your grandfather's documentation will receive thorough professional evaluation, she assured him, her careful phrasing neither confirming nor denying what ultimate disposition might follow that evaluation. As the federal team departed with the bulk of Henry Sullivan's original documentation, Marcus maintained his composed demeanor while internally confirming that his contingency measures remained intact. The automated notification to Dr. Blackwood had been delayed, but not canceled. It would still trigger if he didn't reset the system within the next 8 hours. The digital copies secured throughout the property remained undiscovered, and the distribution packages in the boathouse had not been located during the team's search. Most importantly, the selective nature of the federal seizure had left significant portions of his grandfather's research archive intact, particularly materials documenting the post-war activities and influence operations conducted by officers involved in the original asset diversion. These materials, while less directly focused on the Nazi gold itself, provided essential context for understanding the historical significance of Operation Eagle's Nest and its aftermath. Marcus allowed himself 3 hours of tactical rest, maintaining the disciplined sleep protocol that combat operations had ingrained in his system. He woke at 0400, verified that surveillance of the property continued but at reduced levels, and initiated the next phase of his grandfather's contingency planning. Using the boathouse communications equipment, he sent an encrypted update to Dr. Blackwood, canceling the automated notification while providing specific information about the federal intervention and the materials that had been seized. The communication included access protocols for one of the secure digital copies of the complete archive, ensuring that his grandfather's documentation remained available for potential disclosure regardless of what happened to the physical materials or to Marcus himself. Dawn brought a development that confirmed the multidimensional nature of interest in his grandfather's documentation. His military phone received a text message from an unknown number. Secure call available on alternative channel. Authentication. Protocol, Sierra Echo 942. Time-sensitive situation requires immediate consultation. The authentication protocol matched emergency communication procedures for sensitive operations. Support, a system used only for priority communications, involving national security implications outside normal command channels. Marcus recognized. It has legitimate, but originating outside his direct chain of command, suggesting involvement of specialized units with intelligence or special operations authorities. Using his grandfather's boathouse communications equipment, Marcus established the secure connection while maintaining operational security awareness. The voice that responded carried the clipped precision of senior military command. Captain Sullivan, this is General Malcolm Hargrove, Special Operations Command. Your location and activities have triggered multiple security protocols related to classified historical operations. We need to establish parameters for appropriate handling of this situation outside standard containment procedures. The identification carried significance beyond the rank itself. General Hargrove was known within military circles as Director of Specialized Historical Operations. Review, a position focused on managing security implications of classified Cold War and earlier operations that carried ongoing strategic sensitivities. I understand, sir, Marcus responded, military discipline providing appropriate deference, while revealing nothing about his current situation assessment or contingency measures. Captain, I'll be direct given the time sensitivity, General Hargrove continued. Operation Eagle's Nest and related asset disposition activities from 1945 carry complex security implications that extend beyond simple historical classification. Your grandfather's documentation has activated contingency protocols established decades ago for potential disclosure scenarios. The statement confirmed that Henry Sullivan's documentation had been anticipated by specialized security structures. His grandfather's activities had been monitored but permitted to continue within specific parameters rather than simply terminated through direct intervention. The materials recovered from your property yesterday are undergoing expedited assessment, Hargrove explained. That assessment has already verified the authenticity and comprehensive nature of your grandfather's documentation. What remains undetermined is the appropriate pathway for managing the historical and security implications of these materials. Marcus maintained disciplined silence, recognizing that this communication represented a significant shift from the initial containment approach of the FBI intervention. General Hargrove was initiating negotiation rather than simply imposing security protocols, a change that suggested recognition of the documentation's distributed nature and the potential consequences of attempted suppression. Captain Sullivan, your background and current position provide unique qualification for handling this situation, Hargrove continued. We're prepared to offer specialized operational parameters that would allow controlled historical accountability, while managing security implications for current institutions and international relationships. The proposal confirmed Marcus's assessment of the situation's complexity. Rather than attempting complete suppression of his grandfather's documentation, specialized security authorities were offering negotiated disclosure parameters that would acknowledge historical accountability while limiting institutional damage to current structures. What specific parameters are you proposing, sir? Marcus asked, maintaining professional military communication, while revealing nothing about his existing contingency measures. A specialized historical accountability process conducted through appropriate channels with proper security oversight, Hargrove replied. Full access to original documentation for qualified historians working under controlled protocols. Acknowledgement of factual historical events without punitive focus on institutions that have evolved beyond their origins. Preservation of your grandfather's comprehensive documentation within appropriate historical archives rather than continued classification. The proposal represented significant concession from initial containment objectives, acknowledgement that Henry Sullivan's documentation would eventually enter historical record rather than remaining permanently classified. The emphasis on non-punitive focus suggested concern about institutional stability rather than individual accountability, since most direct participants would have died during the intervening decades. And the physical evidence? Marcus asked, testing parameters by directly referencing the Alpine cache without specifically identifying it. A brief pause suggested recalibration before Hargrove responded. Verification procedures for supporting physical evidence would be included in the historical accountability process, with appropriate security and diplomatic protocols for any recovery operations. The concession confirmed the comprehensive nature of the negotiation offer, not simply acknowledgement of documentary evidence, but potential recovery of the Nazi gold and intelligence materials that would provide irrefutable physical verification of the historical account. What assurances would ensure the process proceeds as described once initiated? Marcus asked, military experience having taught the critical importance of verification mechanisms in any negotiated agreement. Multiple oversight channels including representatives from academic institutions, appropriate congressional committees, and international organizations with relevant historical interests, Hargrove replied. Documentation of process parameters with triggering mechanisms for public disclosure if established protocols are violated. The framework addressed core concerns about potential suppression once Marcus surrendered control of his grandfather's contingency measures. By establishing multiple independent oversight channels with automatic disclosure triggers, The proposal created structural safeguards against simple containment once the process began. I would need to consult with individuals who have relevant expertise before responding to your proposal, Marcus stated, maintaining professional discipline while creating space for strategic assessment. Dr. Eleanor Blackwood would be an appropriate consultation resource, Hargrove acknowledged, confirming awareness of her involvement. She has established credibility in handling sensitive, historical materials with both academic integrity and security awareness. The explicit reference to Dr. Blackwood indicated comprehensive intelligence awareness of Marcus's activities since arriving in Camden, but also represented tacit acknowledgement of her legitimacy as a consultation resource rather than characterizing her as a security concern. I'll need 24 hours for appropriate consultation and consideration, Marcus stated, establishing a clear timeline that would allow thorough evaluation while maintaining operational momentum. Understood, Captain, Hargrove agreed. This communication channel will remain available for your response. One encouraged time-sensitive handling given ongoing interest from multiple entities with varying objectives. Regarding your grandfather's documentation, the warning carried implicit acknowledgement that other interests beyond General Hargrove's Specialized Historical Operations Command might pursue different approaches to the situation, potentially including more aggressive containment strategies if negotiated resolution couldn't be established. After terminating the secure communication, Marcus initiated immediate encrypted contact with Dr. Blackwood, requesting urgent consultation regarding the proposal. Her response came within minutes, suggesting she had been maintaining heightened availability in anticipation of developments. This represents significant evolution from standard containment protocols, she confirmed after Marcus relayed the conversation with General Hargrove. Hargrove's Historical Operations Command has cultivated relationships with academic historians, specifically to manage disclosure scenarios for sensitive historical operations when complete suppression becomes untenable. You've worked with them before? Marcus asked, seeking context for evaluating the legitimacy of the proposal. On 3 occasions involving Cold War operations where documentation emerged through channels they couldn't simply contain, she confirmed. In each case, they maintained the negotiated parameters once the process was established with appropriate oversight mechanisms. The verification provided critical context for assessing the proposal's viability as an alternative to either continued confrontation or complete surrender of his grandfather's documentation. If specialized structures existed specifically for managing disclosure of sensitive historical operations, they might represent the optimal pathway for achieving Henry Sullivan's core objective of historical accountability. What's your assessment of the proposed framework? Marcus asked, recognizing Dr. Blackwood's unique qualification for evaluating both historical and security dimensions of the situation. It represents an institutional evolution that your grandfather likely anticipated, but couldn't directly access. She replied after thoughtful consideration. Henry believed accountability mattered more than punishment of institutions that have evolved beyond their origins. This framework potentially achieves that objective while managing legitimate security concerns about institutional stability. The assessment aligned with Marcus's emerging understanding of his grandfather's ultimate objectives. Henry Sullivan had preserved comprehensive documentation and verification means for eventual historical accountability, but his meticulous approach suggested concern for proper process rather than simply punitive exposure. The physical evidence seems particularly significant in their willingness to negotiate, Marcus observed, recognizing that the Alpine cache represented irrefutable verification that couldn't be dismissed as misinterpretation or exaggeration. The Nazi gold and accompanying intelligence materials would make the historical account undeniable, Dr. Blackwood agreed. Their willingness to include verification and potential recovery in the negotiated framework indicates recognition that Complete suppression is no longer viable once multiple parties know the location and authentication protocols. Throughout the day, Marcus continued methodical evaluation of the proposal while maintaining awareness of the surveillance environment around the Sullivan property. The federal presence had stabilized at what appeared to be observation parameters, rather than preparation for additional intervention, suggesting awaiting the outcome of the negotiation process rather than planning immediate escalation. By evening, after thorough consultation with Dr. Blackwood and careful consideration of his grandfather's documented objectives, Marcus had reached his decision. Using the secure communication channel, he contacted General Hargrove with his response. "General, I'm prepared to cooperate with the historical accountability process you've outlined, contingent on formalized oversight mechanisms with automatic disclosure triggers if established protocols are violated," Marcus stated with military precision. "My objective is ensuring appropriate historical acknowledgement of events documented by my grandfather while respecting legitimate security considerations for evolved institutions. Your conditions are reasonable and consistent with our proposed framework," Hargrove responded. "We can establish the formal parameters within 48 hours, including identification of appropriate academic, congressional, and international oversight representatives. I'll need Dr. Eleanor Blackwood included in the academic oversight component," Marcus specified, establishing a critical condition that would ensure continuity with his grandfather's historical objectives. "Already anticipated in the framework," Hargrove confirmed. "Her expertise and established credibility in handling sensitive historical materials makes her appropriate for the academic oversight component." The negotiation continued with specific discussion of documentation preservation, access protocols for qualified researchers, and verification procedures for the physical evidence. Throughout the process, Marcus maintained the disciplined focus of a military officer conducting mission-critical operations, establishing clear parameters while securing multiple redundant safeguards against potential compromise of the historical accountability objective. By midnight, they had established a comprehensive framework that would transition Henry Sullivan's lifetime documentation mission from private preservation to institutional acknowledgement through specialized structures designed specifically for managing sensitive historical accountability processes. "There's one additional matter to address," Marcus said as they finalized the framework. "My grandfather's documentation extends beyond Operation Eagle's nest itself to include decades of research tracking the post-war activities and influence operations of officers involved in the original asset diversion. That longitudinal documentation is essential for understanding the historical significance of the operation and its aftermath." The request represented potential expansion beyond the original operational documentation to include Henry Sullivan's comprehensive tracking of how diverted assets and compromised individuals had shaped post-war institutional developments, potentially the most sensitive dimension of his grandfather's archive from a current security perspective. After brief consideration, Hargrove responded with what appeared to be genuine professional respect. "Captain Sullivan, your grandfather's thoroughness has been apparent throughout our assessment process. His longitudinal documentation would provide essential historical context. It will be included in the accountability framework with appropriate handling protocols for information related to institutions that have evolved beyond their origins." The concession represented significant expansion of the historical accountability parameters, acknowledging the importance of documenting not just the original operation, but its extended influence on post-war institutional development. It suggested recognition that meaningful historical accountability required understanding both the event itself and its continuing implications through subsequent decades. With formal parameters established and multiple safeguard mechanisms secured, Marcus provided access protocols for the complete digital archive of his grandfather's documentation, now protected through institutional accountability structures. rather than vulnerable to potential suppression or containment. The following morning brought the beginning of implementation as specialized teams arrived to establish the formal accountability process. Academic historians with security clearances, representatives from congressional oversight committees, and delegates from international organizations with relevant historical interests converged on a secure facility where Henry Sullivan's original documentation had been transported. Dr. Blackwood arrived as the academic oversight coordinator, her expression conveying both professional satisfaction and personal vindication as she greeted Marcus at the Sullivan house before departing for the secure facility. "Your grandfather would be proud of how you've handled this," she told him. "He spent decades preserving this evidence while waiting for the right conditions for appropriate historical accountability. You've helped establish those conditions in ways he likely anticipated but couldn't directly access." Marcus accompanied her to the facility, where he provided detailed briefing on his grandfather's documentation organization, research methodology, and verification procedures. The comprehensive nature of Henry Sullivan's archive impressed even specialized historians, accustomed to working with sensitive historical materials. Its professional organization, methodical cross-referencing, and longitudinal tracking of implications extended far beyond what they had anticipated from a supposedly retired veteran working in isolation. As the formal accountability process began, Marcus received updated orders extending his leave status to accommodate his essential role in the historical verification procedures. His commanding officer's message carried the understated acknowledgement of specialized operations. Family matters often require more time than initially anticipated. Take what you need to complete the process properly. The verification phase progressed with methodical thoroughness, comparing Henry Sullivan's documentation with declassified materials from multiple national archives to establish comprehensive authentication of his account. At each stage, the evidence supported his grandfather's meticulous documentation, operational orders, personnel assignments, asset inventories, and subsequent activities, all aligned with independently verifiable records once appropriate connections were established. 3 weeks into the process, the most significant verification milestone arrived. A specialized team including Marcus, Dr. Blackwood, and representatives from the Accountability Framework traveled to Europe to attempt location and authentication of the Alpine cache using Henry Sullivan's detailed guidance. The Bavarian Alps remained remarkably unchanged in the region his grandfather had documented, conservation regulations having prevented development that might have disturbed the carefully concealed underground facility. Using topographical markers and authentication protocols preserved in Henry Sullivan's documentation, the team successfully located the concealed entrance and implemented the mechanical access procedures that still functioned after 70 years. What they discovered inside exceeded even the expectations established by his grandfather's documentation. The Nazi gold, approximately 2,700 pounds of bullion and coins, remained secured in the original military containers, now tarnished but intact. More significantly, the intelligence materials stored alongside the gold provided comprehensive documentation of both the original diversion and subsequent influence operations, conducted using assets and leverage generated through the operation. The physical verification transformed the historical accountability process from documentary analysis to irrefutable confirmation. The Nazi gold's existence, precisely as documented in Henry Sullivan's archive, established the foundation for acknowledging the broader pattern of post-war asset diversion and institutional compromise that his research had methodically tracked for decades. As international protocols were implemented for proper handling of the recovered assets, Marcus found unexpected personal significance in the culmination of his grandfather's lifetime mission. Henry Sullivan had preserved truth through decades of patient, methodical documentation while waiting for the right conditions and the right person to ensure appropriate historical accountability. The specialized structures that General Hargrove had established provided exactly the pathway Henry Sullivan had anticipated: institutional acknowledgement, with appropriate historical recording rather than simply punitive exposure or continued suppression. The framework balanced accountability for historical truth with recognition that institutions had evolved beyond their compromised origins, achieving the core objective of historical accuracy without unnecessarily destabilizing contemporary structures. 2 months after his unexpected inheritance of the Sullivan property in Camden, Marcus stood with Dr. Blackwood at the secure facility, where his grandfather's complete archive had been preserved as the foundation for a comprehensive historical record of Operation Eagle's Nest, the diverted Nazi assets, and their extended influence on post-war institutional development. Your grandfather understood that patience was sometimes the most powerful tool in preserving truth, Dr. Blackwood observed as they reviewed the formal archival organization that would make Henry Sullivan's documentation available to qualified researchers through appropriate protocols. He recognized that direct confrontation would likely result in suppression, while methodical preservation and strategic patience would eventually create conditions for appropriate accountability. He waited 70 years, Marcus noted, still processing the extraordinary dedication his grandfather had maintained throughout his outwardly unremarkable life in coastal Maine. He waited for the right conditions and the right person, Dr. Blackwood corrected. Henry believed truth needed not just preservation, but proper stewardship. Someone who would understand both its significance and the complex ethical considerations of how it should eventually emerge. The assessment provided insight into preservation, why his grandfather had chosen Marcus as his heir despite their limited personal interaction. Henry Sullivan had evaluated his grandson's character and judgment through his military career, identifying qualities that aligned with his own methodical approach to mission accomplishment and ethical decision-making. The Nazi gold makes for dramatic headlines, Dr. Blackwood continued, but the more significant historical contribution is his documentation of how diverted assets and compromised individuals shaped institutional development in ways that continued to influence global events for decades afterward. That longitudinal perspective transforms understanding of post-war history in ways that simple asset recovery never could. As the formal accountability process transitioned to its public phase, with appropriate announcements about the historical operation and recovered assets, Marcus returned to the Sullivan House in Camden, with new understanding of both the property and the grandfather he had barely known. The house revealed itself now as more than simply a family inheritance. It had been the operational base for a lifetime mission conducted with extraordinary patience, discipline, and strategic vision. Every aspect of its design and maintenance reflected Henry Sullivan's methodical approach to preservation and security, creating the conditions that had allowed truth to survive until appropriate accountability became possible. In the boathouse where his grandfather had maintained communication equipment and contingency distribution systems, Marcus discovered a final message that Henry Sullivan had secured for the person who would eventually complete his mission. A sealed envelope addressed simply to the custodian contained a single page of his grandfather's precise handwriting. If you're reading this, you've successfully navigated the complex ethical and security considerations surrounding the documentation I've preserved. Whatever pathway you've established for appropriate historical accountability reflects your own judgment rather than specific direction from me, exactly as intended. Truth matters even after decades, but so does the method of its emergence. Simple exposure without context can create damage that obscures the very accountability it seeks to establish. Patient, methodical preservation creates space for truth to emerge in ways that illuminate rather than simply destroy. The choice of appropriate timing and methods was always yours to make based on conditions I couldn't anticipate from decades earlier. Whatever decisions you've made, I trust they reflect the same commitment to both truth and responsibility that guided my own efforts throughout these years. The mission was never about personal vindication or punitive exposure, but about ensuring that history reflects reality rather than convenient narratives. If you've established conditions where that objective can be achieved, then my lifetime of patience has been justified through your completion of what I could only begin. The truth about Operation Eagle's Nest and its aftermath matters not because of the individuals involved, who have mostly passed beyond earthly accountability, but because institutional integrity requires honest acknowledgement of origins and evolution. Without truth as foundation, even the most impressive structures remain vulnerable to collapse. Thank you for your stewardship of this mission. May the truth serve its proper purpose of illumination rather than merely destruction. Henry Sullivan, Camden, Maine. The message provided final confirmation of his grandfather's extraordinary vision, not merely preservation of historical evidence, but strategic patience in creating conditions where truth could emerge in ways that served accountability without unnecessary destruction. As Marine Captain Marcus Sullivan prepared to return to his unit, having extended his leave to complete the complex process of establishing appropriate historical accountability, he carried with him new understanding of both military service and ethical responsibility. His grandfather had conducted a lifetime mission with the same discipline, strategic patience, and commitment to ultimate objectives that characterized the finest military operations, qualities Marcus recognized in his own approach to service. The Nazi gold recovered from its Alpine cache would generate dramatic headlines and ensure the historical account couldn't be dismissed as exaggeration or misinterpretation. But the more profound legacy of Henry Sullivan's lifetime mission was the comprehensive documentation of how diverted assets and compromised individuals had shaped institutional development in ways that continued to influence global events decades later. Through patient, methodical preservation and strategic vision in identifying the right conditions and the right person for eventual disclosure, Henry Sullivan had ensured that historical truth would finally receive appropriate acknowledgement. His grandson, unexpectedly inheriting not just property but responsibility for a mission 7 decades in execution, had successfully navigated the complex ethical and security considerations to establish conditions where truth could emerge without unnecessary destruction. The Sullivan house in Camden would remain in Marcus's possession, not just as family property, but as monument to the extraordinary patience and discipline that had allowed truth to survive until it could properly emerge. Whatever future missions his military career might bring, Marcus would carry with him the legacy of a grandfather who had demonstrated that sometimes the most powerful weapons in service to truth were methodical documentation, strategic patience, and unwavering commitment to ultimate objectives beyond immediate vindication. The Nazi gold hidden for 70 years had finally served its intended purpose, not as financial gain, but as irrefutable physical evidence supporting historical truth that powerful interests had conspired to conceal. Through the combined efforts of Henry Sullivan's lifetime preservation and Marcus Sullivan's strategic completion, Operation Eagle's Nest had finally entered historical record with appropriate accountability and context. Transformation of classified secrets into illuminating truth that served understanding rather than merely punishment. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.